right. This is my final for philosophy of mind. The stance, excuse me, I chose to defend was the embrace finitude stance. The embrace death stance, because we don't run into all the same problems that you do with any of the immortality or resurrection stances. We get to completely sidestep those problems because you're not worried about living on past death when you accept the cold arms of death. And joking aside, the specific problems we get to avoid are the problems of fighting the fundamental first law of thermodynamics, the arrow of time. So specifically in the book, the Tithonus problem, where we may be immortal, but our bodies and minds are slowly decaying. Or the cannibal problem on page 105, where to explain resurrection, God has to grab those particles that make us up and then put us back together. But due to chemical changes through the process of decay or the process of digestion, the particles that make you up are fundamentally different than the particles that are now, because they're part of a tree now because they decayed into the soil, or they're part of a pig because a pig ate you in the arena, or you're part of a cannibal because when you went to go witness to cannibals, they decided to eat you. So we get to avoid that problem. In regards to the soul problems, we get to avoid defining what a soul is, providing empirical proof for a soul. We get to avoid the question of, is a soul separate from the body truly you, and if so, what's the point of a body? Just a lot of the mess that is the soul we get to avoid. And in regard to the human, or the computer resurrection or immortality, we get to avoid the chance that it's not actually us that's being resurrected, it's the birth of a new person. And I've talked about this already in some detail in the class, but essentially, since the fundamental makeup and the processes of a computer mind are so substantially different from the fundamental makeup and processes of a physical human mind, then it's far more likely that what we're doing when we're downloading a consciousness, or we're programming all of our behaviors and our thoughts and our memories into a computer program, we're simply just giving birth to a new person. And lastly, we get to avoid the problems of the partial resurrection. So for the cultural resurrection, only a part of us is being passed on through our culture, say our ideas or our values, or our behaviors. And same thing goes with the genes. A part of our physical nature is being passed on. Half of our genes are being passed on and rearranged in our children and in our grandchildren. All that being said, I do think that the closest competitor is the cultural immortality. Granted, it could be any of them, since my position is so fundamentally opposite from every other position, but I chose the cultural immortality stance simply because, again, we get to avoid the problems of the soul and machine immortality, and we don't have to fight the fundamental laws of thermodynamics or the arrow of time. That being said, the greatest competitor to it then is the genetic immortality view. But the thing about the cultural immortality view is we're passing on more of ourselves, our personalities. We're passing on our ideas, whether they be political or political, or our ideas on how the universe works. We're passing on our taste in music. I can write a journal and tell you my favorite songs. We're passing on our taste in movies. We're passing on our views on the arts and such. We're passing on a sense of fashion, maybe. We're passing on, most importantly, the fundamental values that make us up. And so one of the problems with this view is that culture is so volatile, it's so drastically shifting, that it's easy to lose ourselves. It's easy. So take, for example, my grandpa in the 60s looks more or less just like me, but his political ideas were very different. His taste in music was very different. His favorite movie is nowhere near my favorite movie. It's not even in the same genre. His favorite foods are different, but the values that he held are the exact same. He taught them to my mom, and my mom taught them to me. And that's what's most important about who he is, who he was, his character. It was the fact that we treated people fairly, the fact that we forgive people. We teach right from wrong. Those are the central and probably the most fundamental parts of our identity, and the fact that we pass those on, and the fact that those are what's most important are passed on, is why I would counter and say that it doesn't necessarily matter that my sense of fashion doesn't get passed on to my children. As long as I teach them and instill in them the proper values, that's what's most important, and that's how I will contribute to culture and my identity. And another counter could be that it's a lot safer to pass on your identity genetically. It's a lot harder to get rid of ideas than it is to get rid of genes. We can see this like immigrants, for example. The second and third generations see a dramatic drop in cultural identity because they're hanging out with let's say they're Italian immigrants and they move to America. Their children are hanging out with Americans. They're not hanging out with Italians like their parents used to. So we see a drastic drop in the original cultural identity, even though, again, the values are passed on through the parents. And to take that example to the extreme, you could say that it's a lot easier to burn a book, to burn a library, to censor the internet or unplug it completely than it is to commit mass genocide. So it's safer to put your bet into the genetic immortality than it is in the cultural. But again, we're losing a fundamental aspect of our identity when we do that. Passing on half of our, and this is a debate that's going to get down to nature versus nurture. Clearly I'm on the side of nurture, or I lean a little more towards the nurture side, but those fundamental ideas that we pass on are far more important. Those fundamental values are far more important than simply our genes. Lastly, the objection to the embrace death view that I chose, or that I came up with, is entirely based on my Christian worldview, and so it's not really going to work for an agnostic or an atheist or a Muslim or a pagan. But I guess I can leave it up to them to come up with their own objections. And it's specifically dependent on my Christian worldview, so it's probably not going to work best as an objection if you hold to a more impersonal God or a B theory of time, or depending on how you interpret the Bible, it's not going to hold up as well. But it's one of the best ones I could think of, I could come up with, that doesn't necessarily run into all the problems that we've previously discussed with the other views. And it's fairly simple. So it goes like this. God either created us to be infinite, eternal beings, or he created us to be finite beings with the plan to make us eternal. And this is because God wants to have an eternal relationship with human beings. So my counter to this objection would be, it doesn't necessarily have to follow that God ever planned to make us infinite, or that he wants an infinite relationship with us. Consequences, and even granting, okay, so we're going to attack this from two sides. So granting on the one hand that God did create us as eternal beings, when Adam and Eve chose to eat the fruit, what we are dealing with are the consequences of those actions. And nowhere in the Bible, nowhere in life do we see God just completely nullifying the actions of our decisions. Samson has to deal with losing his hair or letting his hair get cut. David has to deal with killing another man. Jesus has to deal with consequences of the sin of all mankind. There are consequences to actions, whether they be right, wrong, or neutral, and we have to deal with them regardless. So even if we were created originally as eternal beings, we're dealing with the consequences of an action, and it doesn't necessarily follow that God is going to nullify those consequences. On the other hand, it also doesn't necessarily follow that God ever had the plan to make us into eternal beings. If he were going to make us into eternal beings, why wouldn't he start there? What's the point of starting us as finite beings and with the plan of granting us immortality after death? That seems, at least to me, like a very selfish human desire. It's a desire to keep on living, a desire to keep impacting the world. It's a desire. It's a fear of the unknown. It's a fear of non-existence. And it's not necessarily a bad thing that our time with God is finite. Relationships that are finite are far more precious than relationships that are infinite. And so, for example, if I know my best friend is going to be in town for a couple days, I'm going to want to take off those couple days and spend as much time as I can with them, compared to if I know my best friend's going to be in town for a few months, where we can wait till the weekends to hang out. It doesn't necessarily have to be right now, or else I lose my chance. And the objection to there's a fairly easy objection to this, and it's that infinite relationships allow for eventual sort of perfection and an eventual closeness that can't be broken. But I would argue that a finite relationship would be just as valuable, if not more valuable, because it puts a constraint on the relationship. I only have so much time to get close to you. I only have so much time to make the right decision. Whereas with eternity, I can constantly put it off and put it off. I can do it tomorrow. I've got nothing to worry about because tomorrow holds no value. Today holds no value. But that's just my view. I'm sure there are plenty of counters to it. Um, I can't think of much else, but that's about it.